Welcome back to the Backyard Professor videos. I'm Kerry Schertz, the Backyard Professor. I'm discussing this argument that the Book of Mormon has no archaeological proof for it, no historical proof, no linguistic or cultural information that might be of value to it. And again, I'm going to bring up another very familiar Book of Mormon theme. I've already touched upon it in several of my videos. From the very interesting text, Book of Mormon Authorship, A New Light on Ancient Origins, which was published back in 1982, several LDS scholars got together and presented what they consider to be very interesting evidence in favor of the Book of Mormon. C. Wilfred Griggs, one of the very fine LDS scholars and Egyptologists, discussed the Book of Mormon as an ancient book. And he described, well, let me read this preface to you. His thesis is that the Book of Mormon is indeed an ancient book. He focuses on one passage, the story of the Tree of Life in the Book of Mormon, to demonstrate its striking similarity to other 7th and 6th century BC texts. Various plates of precious metal inscribed with religious texts have been found in burial sites around the Mediterranean. And Griggs reviews these writings and notes the Near Eastern, or more particular, the Egyptian origin of these texts. He then compares Lehi's dream with these ancient texts and concludes that the Book of Mormon account is highly similar both to the writing on the metal plates and tablets, and it's similar to the related Egyptian literature. Very interesting connections here by C. Wilfred Griggs. On page 83 of this text, Griggs notes, the texts correspond to the claim in the Pseudo-Plato Archiocus that the subject of the ancient bronze plates was the fate of the soul in the spirit world. He's talking about the religion called Orphism that began in the Mediterranean around 600 BC, very interestingly. He says on page, I'm going to skip heavily through this. I would highly recommend reading the entire article. I don't have time in this 10-minute video. He says the theme in the Orphic Gold tablets that were written on metal plates, religious themes on ancient metal plates. Here again, the Book of Mormon theme, from an entirely different culture, from the same time period, 600 BC to 700 BC, written on metal plates, some gold, some lead, some tin, some bronze, some silver, but from another culture, the Greeks, in the Mediterranean. We found him in the Assyrians, we found him in the ancient Jews in Jerusalem, 600 BC. We know the ancient Egyptians did so. We have him in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the famous Copper Scroll, and now it's in Orphism on gold plates. Very interesting how this theme occurs again and again and again. Only this time the gold plates have a connection with the Egyptian ideas as well as the Tree of Life dream of Lehi and Nephi in the Book of Mormon. It's fascinating how it keeps coming up. He says, the tree is beside a spring of water. This has been consistently been identified as a tree of life. And the Greek phrase, it calls it a white cypress. The white cypress is in line with such marvelous trees as the silver apple tree of the Celts, or the 12-fruited tree of the Revelation. In the present instance of the so-called Orphic texts, virtually all modern scholars have suggested an Egyptian origin for them because of the reference of the gold tablets to cold water. Very interesting how he brings in that connection with cold water. And I'm going to skip heavily because I want to just touch on some main highlights of this theme by Dr. Griggs. The accounts of Lehi's dream in the Book of Mormon have much in common with the gold tablets and the related Egyptian literature. The Book of Mormon narrative claims Egyptian ties. The Book of Mormon probably is quite similar to the mercantilistic connections of the Greeks in Egypt. The Book of Mormon begins at the close of the 7th century BC, so the time is right. coinciding with the 7th to 6th century origins of the religious materials on the Greek gold plates. That is when they originated, according to the scholarship. Now, these are archaeologically discovered texts dealing with religious and historical matters. The use or the borrowing of typical Egyptian motifs and the inscription of religious writings upon gold plates, these are considered significant because the striking resemblance in all the materials under the discussion would be remarkably coincidental if they were not connected to a common source or origin. But they are connected to a common source or origin. Since the Greek gold tablets they appear to have an Egyptian origin, this agrees in time and content with the Egyptian associations of the Book of Mormon itself. The most feasible and plausible explanation for the internal characteristics shared by both the gold tablets of the Greeks and the gold tablets of the Book of Mormon is that the 7th to 6th century BC Egypt is the common meeting house for the two traditions. That is interesting how the Egyptian connections occur. I want to try to get to the, I skipped too much some here. Here we go. Here's what he says. Texts have been found similarly inscribed on both silver and bronze. He's already talked about the golden Orphic tablets. He says other texts have been found inscribed on silver and bronze, as have prescriptions for writing protection with religious spells on tablets of gold, silver, bronze, and tin. He says that on pages 80 and 81. The Orphic Gold Plates perhaps provide the best examples of such early religious texts inscribed on tablets of gold and buried in the ground. Another Book of Mormon theme. There are at least 17 such gold Orphic plates known at the present time. They are found in ancient burial sites in such widely scattered areas as Italy, in Greece, and in Crete. In other words, all over the Mediterranean, both north and south. The plate known longest was probably discovered in the 18th century, although it was not published until 1836. And just recently, we have found another discovered plate. Came to light in 1972, but it wasn't published until 1976. So current and recurrent archaeological discoveries are occurring with writings on ancient metal plates. And it doesn't matter what kind of metal. And they are religious writings to boot. These particular religious writings tie in with the Egyptian connection of the literature because the writings, Griggs says, have to do with the soul after death and how the soul is to get into heaven. This is a fascinating theme. It's a very religious theme that finds itself in the Book of Mormon also. Of course, that makes sense. These were the celebrations, what these tablets were talking about, this religion, is they were the celebrations of mystery acts relating to a mystical death and resurrection for the living. And doesn't the Book of Alma and the Book of Mormon, written on those gold plates, discuss heavily the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead? Indeed it does. Absolutely. Now, commentators agree that the material on the gold plates was not indigenous to Greece, but they present foreign influences from the 6th century or earlier. So this scholar, Zuntz, he suggests that the apparent cultic influence on the earlier version of the ritual formulary may well have come from Egypt. And we know that the Egyptian influence is very strong in the Book of Mormon. So this is an all too brief description of C. Wilfred Griggs' fantastically interesting article on these Orphic gold plates. But what we have is a clearly established pattern in antiquity, thanks to Brother Griggs' work, as well as John Twetnus, as well as Hugh Nibley, as well as John Sorensen, who has found some Mesoamerican materials similar to the Book of Mormon. Very interesting that. Here we have yet another culture, the Greeks, another religion, Orphism, discussing the same concepts: the resurrection of the dead, the fate of the soul after this life, the tree of life by a stream of water, how to gain eternal life, etc. And all of it's written on metal plates. I believe this overall ancient theme, discovered through archaeological methods and applied to historical understandings and religious meanings, it refutes the argument that the Book of Mormon has nothing in its favor. That argument is simply false.